so that you may not be judged. See, the judge is standing at the doors. And as an example of suffering and patience, beloved, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Indeed, we call blessed those who showed endurance. You have heard of the endurance of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. Above all, my beloved, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. This is the word of the Lord. We're going through the book of James, and every week I refer to it as a practical book about how to live as a Christian. But if you've ever read the book of James or spent time in it, you might have other ways to describe the book. I've heard difficult. I've heard that the book of James is annoying. It's too much of a challenge. It's hard to apply. A lot of people are afraid of the book of James because it seems very, very strong, very, very harsh, very, very difficult. It doesn't seem that practical. Rather, it seems like it's something that we can't do a lot of the time. And the reason I thought about why is that? Why is the book of James such a difficult book to read or to understand or even to apply to our lives? And one of the reasons, at the very least, I found is that the book of James deals with things that you and I do every single day. He's not talking about principles or ideas or thoughts. He's talking about the things that you and I do every single day throughout our week. How we go to work, what words we use, how we spend our money, who we become friends with. And it's hard to read the book of James because it's like somebody taking a microscope and looking at your life. And of course, when we do that, we start to see all the ugliness in our life, we start to see all the things we fail at in our lives. And that's difficult, right, for us to take. And today, James talks about probably one of the most difficult lessons that we need to learn as Christians. He's talking about the issue of patience. Having deep, deep patience for others in your life and also for God. And if we're honest, the men in this room, this sermon is for us. The women, women that get patience. Women are better at patience than the men are in this room. And so for the men, we need to pay attention to what James really is saying here. He's talking about how to have patience, how to deal with people and be long-suffering for them. To look at people and to look at God and say, how do I get this deep, deep, glorious patience? See, in verse 7, let's give some context here to what's going on. In verse 7, if you look at that, he says, be patient. Why? He says, be patient until the coming of the Lord. What does he mean by that? What is that? What is he saying? Most likely, he's writing to Christians who are in a foreign culture, and most likely he's telling them, he's saying to them, you are forgetting the fact that one day, very soon, the Lord will return. You're forgetting that fact. You're not living in light of eternity. You're not seeing the long-term picture that James is saying. And because, James says, you're not seeing the long-term picture of your life, you are growing impatient. You're growing impatient with one another and with God. So he says, be patient until the coming of the Lord, because he knows that the minute you and I forget heaven, the minute you and I forget about eternity, that we forget the long-term picture, we only can see what is in front of our face, and therefore we start to grow impatient. In the book The Hobbit, the famous book The Hobbit, you have the main character, Bilbo Baggins, and he's in a cave and he's lost. He's lost Gandalf, he's lost his friends, but he says, I'm going to make it out of this cave. I'm going to be okay. He has hope. He says, I'm going to make it out of this cave. I just have to keep walking forward. But what happens? The cave gets darker and darker. And there's a point where it says that he couldn't even see his hand held in front of his own face. It was so dark. And it's at that minute that Bilbo starts to complain. He starts to grumble. He starts to say, why did I go on this trip? Why did I listen to Gandalf? I could be at home right now. I could be relaxing. Why did I do this? I want to go back. I shouldn't be on this adventure. And it's the same thing with you and I, that when things start to look dark in our lives, when we start to not be able to see beyond a few inches in front of our face, when we can't see eternity and heaven and God's purpose, what happens to us? We grow impatient. We start to grudge. We start to grumble. We start to complain. And so in the passage today, I want to look at three things. First, what does James say about our impatience, our lack of patience with other people first, with other human beings? He talks about our impatience with others, and then he talks about our impatience with God. How we grow impatient with God so quickly. And then lastly, he gives us a glimpse, a picture of the true source of patience. That if we have this in our life, it'll take discipline. It won't come overnight. But slowly we can start to be changed to have more and more patience for other people and for God. So what does he say here? First, look at verse 9. If you have your Bibles open, he says, do not grumble against others. Don't grumble. And what this word actually means is, it means complaining. It means sighing or groaning at other people. He's saying that what they're doing is they're looking at their Christian brothers and sisters and they're groaning, they're complaining about them, and they're grumbling. Now, you and I would agree that to complain about somebody is not a good thing, right? It's not good to complain about people. But, you notice what James says here, if you look further in verse 9. James doesn't just say that grumbling is sort of a bad thing. He doesn't say grumbling is so-so. He doesn't say, just don't do it, be nice. He says, no, don't grumble, because if you do, you will be judged. Judged. And he says, the judge, God, is standing at the door. Now, that sounds, to me, pretty strict, pretty severe. Why does James believe that when you and I complain against one another, when you and I roll our eyes at one another, when you and I grumble at one another, why does he believe that that is evil and deserving of judgment? Well, you have to know a little bit about grumbling. See, when you start to grumble, when I start to grumble at somebody, there comes a moment where it's the seed. Grumbling is the seed of something bigger. Now, one day I may grumble or complain about somebody, and the next day I may complain about another person and another person, and every day it multiplies and it grows. C.S. Lewis, and probably my favorite book of all time, has a beautiful example of this. It's a book called The Great Divorce, and when you hear me preach, I'll probably quote it a lot because it is one of my favorite books. And it's a fictional story. It's a story about a man who has a dream. And he dreams that he's on the edge of heaven, on the outskirts of heaven. And there are these ghosts, these ghosts that come up from hell, and they make visits. And then when they make a visit, the spirits, the solid people, the sort of angels, come from heaven, and they come down to the edge, and they try to talk them in to coming to heaven. They try to convince them to come to heaven, tell them how good heaven is, and how glorious it will be to be in the presence of God. And more often than not, these ghosts from hell, they don't listen. They don't want heaven. They say, no, I don't want that for any other reason. But C.S. Lewis has a great part in this book, and I'm going to read a section for it. Now, I have to tell you that I'm going to read a little fast, okay? I know I talk fast anyway, but I'm going to read fast, and there's a point, there's a reason why I'm going to read fast. It's because the person in here in this book is reading fast. And what C.S. Lewis wants to communicate is what grumbling really, really does, what it is. It's not just a complaint. It's much more than that. And in this passage, the dreamer is, he's looking at these ghosts, he's watching them, and he's watching their conversations with the solid people, and he has a teacher. A guide, who's taking him through and explaining certain things to him about why these ghosts refuse to go to heaven. And he says here, at this moment, we were suddenly interrupted by the thin voice of a ghost talking at an enormous speed. Remember, I said I was going to read fast, so prepare yourself. Looking behind us, we saw the creature. It was addressing one of the solid people and was doing so too busily to notice us. Every now and then, the solid spirit tried to get in a word, but without success. The ghost talked with something like this. "Oh, my dear, I've had such a dreadful time. I don't know how I ever got here at all. I was coming with Eleanor Stone, and we arranged the whole thing, and we were to meet at the corner of Sixth Street. I made it perfectly plain because I knew what she was like, and if I told her once, I told her 100 times, I would not meet her outside that dreadful Majora Banks woman's house. Not after the way she treated me. That was one of the most dreadful things that ever happened to me. I've been dying to tell you because I felt sure you'd tell me I acted rightly. No, wait a moment, dear. Wait till I told you. I tried living with her when I first came, and it was all fixed up. She was to do the cooking, and I was to live at the house, and I did think, and I was going to be comfortable after all I'd been through. And she turned out to be so changed, absolutely selfish. Not a particle of sympathy for anyone but herself. And as I once said to her, I do think I'm entitled to a little consideration because you at least lived out your time, but I ought to have been years and years and years yet." The shrill, monotonous whine died away as the speaker, still accompanied by the bright, patient, solid person at her side, moved out of hearing. "What troubles you, my son?" asked my teacher. "Well, I'm troubled, sir," I said, "because that unhappy creature doesn't seem to me to be the sort of soul that ought to be in danger of damnation. She isn't wicked. She's only a silly, garrulous old woman who has gotten into a habit of grumbling. And it feels that a little kindness, a little rest, would change her and make her all right." "Ah," my teacher said, "that is what she once was. That is maybe what she still is. If so, she certainly will be cured. But the whole question is whether she is now a grumbler." Well, I said, "I should have thought that she was no doubt about that. She was grumbling." "Aye," my teacher said, "but you are misunderstanding. The question is whether she is a grumbler or only a grumbler. If there is a real woman, even the least trace of one still there inside the grumbling, it can be brought to life again. If there's one wee spark under all those ashes, we'll blow it till the whole pile is red and clear. But if there's nothing but ashes, we'll not go on blowing them up in our eyes forever. They must be swept up." What C.S. Lewis is saying here is in this example, if you listen when the woman was talking, what was she saying? I, me, everything. She was complaining because she felt that she didn't get what she deserved from other people. She felt that other people were not giving her her just due rights. And so she grumbled. And what the teacher says here is that she was grumbling, but then later on she became a grumble itself. She changed. And James is saying the same thing to us. He's saying, as we complain about one another, we open judgment up from God, because complaining is the seed that makes you and I into nothing more than complaints. We walk around saying, well, that person did this to me, I deserve better. That person took this from me, I deserve that, right? And it becomes an endless autobiography. I, me. And James knows that this impatience with others is just one step towards hell. Every time we do it. And so he paints that picture of the impatience that we have with others when we grumble, but he also talks about our impatience with God. If you look at verse 10, James says, look at the prophets who endured, right? What James is saying is that you and I grow impatient not only with each other, but we grow impatient with God. And when does that happen? It happens when our lives are not going the direction that we think they ought to go. We grow impatient with God when our lives are going down a path that we think looks stupid, looks ridiculous, looks meaningless. When our lives don't seem not to make sense to us, we start to grumble against God. We start to complain. And James uses the prophets. I wish I had more time to go through all the prophets to illustrate this point that he's making here. But James is basically saying to you and I, he says, look, if you're frustrated about your life, if you don't think your life is going the direction that it ought to go, wow, look at the prophets. Let me just give I wish I could do more, we don't have enough time. Let me give a few examples. Isaiah chapter 6, if you look at that, the famous verse of, here I am, God, send me. What does God tell him right after that? He says, you're going to go talk about me for about 20 to 30 years to people, and no one's ever going to listen to you. You're going to be a failure, Isaiah. You're going to go talk to people and proclaim the gospel for about 20 to 30 years, and not one person is going to listen to you. Not one person is going to look at you. You're not going to change anybody. Now go. Jeremiah, better example. Jeremiah, God comes to him and says, okay, Jeremiah, I want you to go tell my people, the Israelites, go tell them that they need to submit to a pagan king, Nebuchadnezzar. They have to submit to him because I'm going to use Nebuchadnezzar to teach them a lesson. And Jeremiah says, okay, fine, I'll go. He goes and tells the Israelites, you have to submit to this pagan king. And of course, they don't listen to him. They don't do it. And later on in the book, God goes to Jeremiah again, and he says, okay, now you're going to go into exile, and I want you to tell the people who are in exile that they have to not only embrace this pagan city, they have to pray for it. They have to work in this pagan city for the pagan king. And this would have been treason. This would have been treason for Jeremiah to do this. And there's a point in Jeremiah chapter 11 where his friends get together, and they even say, his friends get together and they say, you know, we need to kill him. We probably need to get rid of him. He's a traitor. And God says to Jeremiah, go. Do it. I wish I could more of the last example. Hosea, probably the best example of this. God says, Hosea, you're going to be a prophet, but in order for you to be a good prophet, I want you to know my relationship with my people. So he says, Hosea, you're going to go marry a woman, Gomer, and not one day of your marriage will she ever be faithful to you. He says, Hosea, you will always have to go out into the marketplace, out in the middle of the city, in shame and embarrassment, and buy Gomer back, so that you know what my relationship is like with my people, and so that you can be my prophet. He says, Hosea, go and do it. Now, we could go, give me a prophet, we could do this all day. What James is saying is, when you look at the prophets' lives, you have a great example of ultimate patience with God, because their lives looked meaningless. Their lives looked ridiculous. The things God was telling them to do looked utterly stupid. Everyone around them said, why would you do that? And all they could say was, God told me to. That's all they could say. I'm going to give another illustration of this I have. My wife gives me great books to read. If you ever need a book recommendation, go to my wife. She has great ones. And she gave me one a while back called The Princess and the Goblin. It's a story by George MacDonald. It's a great story. It's a fairy tale about a princess, of course, and goblins. And the goblins are trying to get the princess. And the princess has to stay in the castle all the time. Because if she goes out at night, the goblins will kidnap her, and they have a war going on with the humans, with the king. And the princess is in her room, and every once in a while she walks upstairs, and she has a fairy grandmother who's upstairs. Every once in a while. She talks with the fairy grandmother. Most oftentimes she just walks upstairs and she can talk with her. And there's one point in the book where the fairy grandmother looks at her and says, listen, the goblins are coming. You're going to be in trouble. And when you're in trouble, princess, I want you to do something. And she takes the ring from the princess's hand and she ties a thread around that ring. The grandmother's sewing things, so she's got a lot of thread. She takes a thread and ties it around the ring. She says, put this under your pillow. And when you're in trouble, what I want you to do is take the thread and I want you to follow it. But, she says, you have to follow the thread. The thread won't always lead you directly upstairs. The thread may lead you in places that you don't feel familiar with, that you feel uncomfortable with, that are scary, that are dreadful. She says you have to follow that thread. And no one else can see the thread but you. And no one else can feel the thread but you. And so later in the story, of course, the princess is in trouble. The goblins are coming. She's panicked. She's fearful. What does she do? She reaches under her pillow. She takes that thread and she follows the thread. But it doesn't take her upstairs. It takes her outside of the house at night. It takes her to the mountains. It takes her into the caves where the goblins live. It takes her to the very heart of danger. It looks meaningless. It looks stupid. It looks ridiculous. But she keeps following that thread. And she follows it and she actually rescues Curdy, who's a younger boy who is one of the heroes of the book. And he says, how did you find me here? And she said, well, I followed my thread. And he says, well, how are we going to get out? And she says, follow the thread. And she follows the thread, but he doesn't see the thread. And he says, no, you can't go that way. I already tried. You can't get out of the cave that way. You only run into the goblins. She says, I have to follow the thread. That's what my grandmother told me to do. Having patience with God is following that thread when it looks ridiculous, when it looks meaningless, when it looks stupid. Now, how do we do it? How do you and I get this patience with one another where we stop grumbling? How do you and I get this patience with God where we stop grumbling with Him? When we can follow that thread into the caves and into the dark places of our lives. How do we get there? Well, James, he talks about it here. In verse 11 is probably the best example of sarcasm being used in the Bible. Sarcasm. And I know many people don't think that sarcasm is in the Bible, but James is sort of doing that here. He's being a little sarcastic. In verse 11, he brings up the example of Job, right? He says, you've heard about Job's endurance. Now, this is strange. Job, of course, if you know the story, Job went through a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, a lot of loss. And we think that he endured, but if you remember the book of Job, he wasn't that patient. He complained. His friends complained even more, but Job complained a lot. And in the end of the book of Job, do you remember in chapter 41, you can look this up later, what does Job do? He ultimately complains to God. And he says, why are you doing all this to me? What is your problem? See, James is using the example of Job to show us that Job really wasn't that patient, any more than you and I are. There's actually one time the word patience is used in the entire book of Job. One time. And it's Job 14:19, and it actually is when they say to Job, you are killing patience, Job. You're killing hope. So Job wasn't patient. He endured, yes. He suffered. But at the end of the book of Job, what happens? God comes to him and says, wait, you're complaining about me? He says, how dare you, Job, complain to me? Now let me ask you some questions, Job. And he looks at Job and says, did you make the world? Did you make the seas? Did you make the stars? See, James is using the example of Job because he's being a little sarcastic. He's saying, you and I are no more patient than Job is. He said, you've heard the story of Job, but here's where it gets beautiful. He says, but you've seen the results of the Lord. He said, you've heard about Job, but you've seen it. Now, this is the same way that if I were to tell you about love, about falling in love, and how great it is, I could tell you stories about falling in love, but you know, when you see true love between people, it's different than hearing about it. And he uses these two verbs, James does, because he wants us to see the distinction. He says, you've heard about the impatience of Job, but you've seen the result of the Lord. And the word result here is telos. It's a Greek word. And it's used another time in the book of Romans when Paul says that Jesus is the telos of God. Jesus is the result, the ultimate culmination of God. What's he saying here? James knows if you want patience, you can't try, you can't will patience. You know this. I mean, how many times have we failed by just telling ourselves, tomorrow I'm going to be more patient, tomorrow I'm going to be more patient. James knows that if you want deep patience, you have to look at the story, look at the telos of Jesus Christ on the cross. And on the cross, you will see the ultimate patience of God being given out for you and for me. He says, you've heard about Job. And you know, we're all like Job. When we go through suffering, we complain to God. When we go through suffering, we complain about one another. But he says, if you look at the cross and see the result of God's patience on the cross, you will be changed deeply and radically. How? If you see that Jesus went to the cross to die for you, if you see that result on the cross, God's ultimate patience, looking at you and saying, you are a sinner, you're so lost, you complain about me all the time, you complain to each other all the time, and yet I will forgive you. And yet I will give my son for you. When we see that, what happens to us? We're humbled humbled so deeply that we don't look at each other and say, we don't feel like I deserve anything from another person. So therefore, we complain less about each other. We don't feel that we are owed anything by anybody else. We become less like the woman in the book. It's not about I, me. We begin to serve others, to love and care for others, more than ourselves. So the complaining stops horizontally, but the complaining stops vertically. We stop to complain about God because we know that ultimately our lives, like the prophet's lives, however ridiculous it looks right now, however meaningless our lives look right now, it is in God's hands. And on the cross, He showed ultimate patience for us. We came from China, my wife and I, our last country that we lived in. We lived by a river where there were a lot of stray cats. And I remember one of our friends, he had fished one of the cats out of the river to save him when the cat was drowning. But he told me a story one time about a cat he tried to pull out of the river. One time he was successful. He pulled and saved the cat out of the river. But one time he tried to, and he says when he reached in, he ran all the way down by the riverside, tries to pull this cat out to save the cat's life. And the cat scratched him and clawed him and ate at him, and so much so that his arm was bleeding and he would throw him back. And this was a pretty strong guy, but he had to throw him back into the river. He couldn't hold on to him anymore. And you and I know that when we complain against God, God's patience is doing just that. On the cross, He comes to us and He says, you can scratch me, you can claw me, you can bite me, you can kick against me, but I will save you. I won't throw you back. I can't because I love you that much. God showed ultimate patience by reaching in and grabbing us and pulling us out, saving our lives at the risk of His sons. I know this is not an easy message, and like I kind of joked before, it's more for the men in the room because we suffer from impatience more, I think. At least I do. But God gave His Son so that when you're holding that thread like the princess in your life, when you're walking that thread and it looks like it's going to the darkest of dark places, it looks meaningless, it looks like you're not going to get what you deserve, it looks utterly hopeless, God says follow it. Because Jesus followed His thread all the way to the cross. And on the other side of the cross was resurrection. He followed His thread in the darkest cave ever, death. Because He knew on the other side was resurrection for you and for me. As long as we follow that thread and rest only in the patience of God shown on the cross through Jesus Christ. Pray with me. Lord, in our lives, we're always seeking to cultivate a sense of patience, a deep patience, Lord, for our brothers and sisters, for our friends, for our family, for our spouses. But we know that the patience, Lord, starts with you. It started with you on the cross. Help us to see the cross. Help us to see that every day. The good news that though we were like that cat kicking and screaming and clawing, you saved us and do it again and again. You did it once and for all on the cross. Lord, help us to follow that thread towards you. Help us to seek out your will in our lives, not our will. Help us to know what patience is. And Lord, we know that it won't come overnight. We need you every day, Lord. We need to come to you every day. We need to be quick to say I'm sorry to people. We need to be quick to forgive others. We need to be quick to think more about others than we do about ourselves. Lord, I pray that you will help us in that pursuit by teaching us the gospel, by teaching